Western civilization has benefited greatly from the discoveries of modern science. We've learned a great deal about the universe, our solar system, planet, and how life functions, not to mention the tremendous technologies that we use every day, smartphones and smart TVs, and so on. However, after the European Enlightenment gained control of the universities, Westerners have increasingly been told that science and reason have eliminated any place for God in reality. Noted figures within the science community have been making these comments for decades.
Darwinism removed the whole idea of God as the creator of organisms from the sphere of rational discussion. Darwin pointed out that no supernatural designer was needed, since natural selection could account for any known form of life. There was no room for a supernatural agency in its evolution. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer need or room for the supernatural. Evolutionary man can no longer take refuge from his loneliness in the arms of a divinized father figure whom he has himself created. Correct science does demand that supernatural concepts be kept out of natural events. Darwin made theological, or spiritual, explanations of the life processes superfluous.
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be.
Darwin taught us that we can understand life's history in purely naturalistic terms, without recourse to the supernatural, or divine. The supernatural is automatically off limits, as an explanation of the natural world. Darwin does away with the reason for believing in a divine creator. There is a fundamental conflict here, one that can never be reconciled, until all religions cease making claims about the nature of reality. Science makes God unnecessary. The laws of physics can explain the universe, without the need for a creator.
A basic principle of propaganda. Boldly say it loud and often, and many will assume that it is true. Thus, many in Western civilization have been persuaded that science has eliminated God.
I don't believe in God, first of all. Maybe because I grew up in an age of science.
These assertions by noted scientists openly equating science with atheism sounded a bit odd to me, given the introduction to science that I was given at home and in college. My father was a biology department head at a state college in Michigan, and I lived at home during my first 2 years of college, when I took classes in general biology, general zoology, physical anthropology, physics, and so on. However, while an evolutionist, my father saw the need for a designing intelligence behind the form and order of nature and life. The popular general biology textbook that my dad used in class even asserted that science had no business making any kind of statements about the supernatural, because that was beyond its scope and methods.
The point is that the concept of God is outside the domain of science, and science cannot legitimately say anything about him. He cannot be tested by science, because its method is inapplicable.
So what is going on with these guys crowing about how science has eliminated God from the scientific discussion of reality? Are they really speaking for science, or promoting their own philosophical agenda? When science and reason are mentioned, then evidence and logical analysis must be applied to investigate the validity of assertions such as these. It may come as a surprise, but contrary to what is often claimed, what we think of as traditional science and reason did not begin with the Enlightenment, but existed long before that time. When most people think of the rise of modern Western science, they do not think of 18th century European philosophers who were skeptical of and hostile towards biblical theism. As Alfred North Whitehead and J. Robert Oppenheimer have pointed out, actually, we think back to earlier figures who were biblical theists, and whose actual scientific accomplishments have stood the test of time pretty well because they actually were based on observation and evidence. By charting when they lived, it becomes obvious that modern Western science began long before the French Enlightenment. Roger Bacon, Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Francis Bacon, Galileo, Johannes Kepler, Blaise Pascal, and Sir Isaac Newton. Traditional science was focused on trying to understand how nature actually operated, so the emphasis was on observing natural processes, collecting and analyzing real evidence from the natural world. Foundational was the scientific method, more technically known as inductive empiricism, a method of investigation by which observations are made and evidence is collected and analyzed so as to lead the investigator towards the best explanation. Conclusions were drawn after the observations and evidence were examined and analyzed. In other words, you follow the evidence wherever it leads.
Anything to which the scientific method can be applied, now or in the future, is or will be science. Anything to which the method cannot be applied is not science.
While there are some variations, the scientific method usually involves 5 basic steps. First, you identify an issue that needs to be understood. Second, observations are made and evidence is collected and analyzed. Third, a hypothesis or a tentative explanation is formed. 4, the hypothesis is tested to see if it is the best explanation for available evidence. If there are problems with the hypothesis, then it is adjusted and retested or dropped and a new hypothesis is formulated. If the hypothesis passes the tests, then it becomes a theory, but one that is still open to future revision as more evidence becomes available.
All science begins with observation, the first step of the scientific method. Experimentation is the 4th step in the scientific method. At this point, science and non-science completely part company. Answers without evidence are at best unsupported opinions, at worst wishful thinking and fanatical illusions.
Science is the study of testable, observable phenomena.
It is a central tenet of science that any theory must be testable and grounded in evidence, not belief.
Well, this was the concept of science that I learned, trying to understand reality by observing it and analyzing all available evidence. Reason, also, was not assuming and promoting atheism, but using logic to make the best sense of available evidence and how it all relates to reality. When people hear the words reason and science, they tend to think of honest collection and open-minded evaluation of evidence, leading towards the best explanation. When they hear comments, as we saw above, that science and reason have removed the need for God, they assume that these conclusions and the Enlightenment's new stories are rooted in observation and evidence, rather than a predetermined philosophical commitment to atheism. I eventually found that just because a person is a scientist does not guarantee that everything they say is a scientific statement. After years of Sunday school, aside from a few well-known stories, I knew zilch about the Bible. But in the back of my mind, it still seemed likely that there was a designing intelligence behind the universe and life. And after 5 years of secular education, I had often heard evolution associated with reason, science, evidence, and asserted to be the explanation for everything, while the Bible was portrayed as nothing more than ancient Middle Eastern mythology, in effect, fiction. So, in my mid-20s, there I was, college-educated, with bachelor's degree in hand, and not sure of what to believe about anything. So, when challenged by a friend about the Bible and evolution, my real education began. For it was at this point that I realized it was time for me to start reading, thinking, and trying to sort out what I was going to believe about reality. If the Bible was describing reality, then it needed to make the best sense of available evidence. If the general evolution scenario and its major stories were true, then they also needed to make the best sense of available evidence. Over the years, I've learned a few things. First, while some want to believe that educated people are inherently rational and objective, I have found that regardless of class or education, most people tend to follow the crowd, and we are all susceptible to social and peer pressure to conform to cultural trends, dogmas, and orthodoxies. We are capable of being independent thinkers and allowing evidence and reason to lead us towards truth and reality. But it is much easier to go with the cultural flow and accept the confidently promoted assertions of those currently held to be the experts. This seems to occur within religious and secular cultures. Second, there is a big difference between trusting some expert who says there's overwhelming evidence for something and being personally persuaded by actually seeing and investigating that evidence for yourself. I was never really persuaded to believe any evolution stories from my own consideration of evidence, but trusted the people who were asserting that there was lots of evidence and that evolution was the only story that made sense of it. Third, very little solid evidence or logic is required for things that people already want or are willing to believe. And no amount of evidence is sufficient to persuade people to believe something that they do not want to believe, especially if it could cost them their job or popularity. A little honest truth-seeking skepticism can be a very healthy thing. I'm not referring to a predetermined resistance to an idea, but to an open-mindedness that is willing to believe only if convinced by evidence and logic. When you evaluate something without first assuming that it is true or false, it's much easier to evaluate its validity and strengths, as well as recognize unsupported assumptions and assertions, weaknesses, and contradictions. The word mythology gets thrown around quite a lot these days, so let's be sure we understand what it refers to. The word myth derives from the Greek word mythos, which referred to a word, saying, or story. The modern tendency is to use myth as a synonym for fiction, but myths are not necessarily false stories. Every individual and culture needs foundational answers to the basic questions of origins, purpose, and destiny. How did we get here? Why are we here? And what is yet to come? And this need is fulfilled by an imagined big picture of reality, a worldview, or a myth. Every worldview or myth involves some unproven assumptions upon which people do the rest of their thinking and reasoning. Since they are foundational to how reality is understood, worldviews and myths tend to be embraced emotionally as authoritative and factual accounts, no matter how much they may ultimately agree with or differ from observations, evidence, and experience. Questioning a worldview that is rooted in emotion tends to bring forth an emotional response, not a humble, open-minded discussion about weaknesses and alternative explanations in a search for truth. Instead, whether medieval church authorities or secular science authorities, you hear dogmatic assertions of the settled truth of the currently popular myth and how everyone who is anyone believes it, denial that criticisms and alternatives have any validity, and ridicule towards anyone ignorant enough to dare question the reigning mythology. Contrary to mythos was logos, which referred to truth that could be supported by logic, observation, and evidence. Only time and accumulating evidence can help to distinguish which myths describe reality and which are fictional. As I began to survey the scientific literature, I realized that evolutionists were very hypocritical in their approach to science, evolution, and the creationist and intelligent design alternatives. We have seen that traditional science is rooted in open-minded observation and collecting and analyzing evidence in order to arrive at the best explanation. And there's nothing wrong with having an explanatory story and then seeing if it explains the evidence. In fact, it is called deduction, and even part of the scientific method, known as testing a hypothesis. However, the judge in the early 1980s Arkansas balanced treatment case, with a good deal of secular coaching, attacked the creationist view for beginning with an assumed story and then trying to find evidence to support it.
The judge said creationist methods, in the realm of science, differed from those of other scientists. The creationists' methods do not take data, weigh it against the opposing scientific data, and thereafter reach conclusions. Instead, they take the literal wording of the book of Genesis and attempt to find scientific support for it.
I would assert that this is exactly how the Enlightenment stories were formulated and promoted. First, they wanted biblical supernaturalism to be false and simply rejected it altogether. Then they assumed that materialistic naturalism had to be the only possible explanation, formulated stories based on that philosophical scenario that would contradict biblical ideas at every possible point, and finally embraced and promoted the most plausible-sounding stories as rational, scientific, and true, whether accumulating evidence supported them or not. Sometimes, and it is especially true of the origin of life and human evolution, stories were imagined and promoted as science without any observations or hard evidence to support them. Second, in the same 1980s trial, philosopher of science Michael Ruse, a defender of Darwinism, diminished the importance of observation and direct evidence in science, implying that this was another creationist error.
Dr. Ruse, have you ever seen reference to observability as an attribute of science?
Well, I've certainly seen reference to it in the scientific creationist literature.
How do creation scientists use the term observability?
Well, they seem to make it an essential characteristic of science, and they tend to use it in the sense of direct eyewitness observation.
Now, as a philosopher of science, do you believe that observability is an attribute of science?
I wouldn't want to say that direct, empirical evidence is important for every aspect of every science.
My college biology textbook and National Geographic were not creationist literature, but these were the kinds of sources that taught me to view observation and evidence as essentials to the scientific enterprise. When I did encounter creationist literature, it agreed with what I had earlier learned from secular sources.
All science begins with observation, the first step of the scientific method.
Science is the study of testable, observable phenomena. Science exists because of the evidence.
It is a central tenet of science that any theory must be testable and grounded in evidence, not belief.
I have read numerous articles in which dark matter is portrayed as something scientists are sure is there because it helps to make sense of other things, although they cannot directly detect it with their senses or even with the sensitive instruments currently available. If you can believe in dark matter that cannot be detected directly because it helps to make sense of some other things, what is wrong with belief in a designer that cannot be detected directly but makes the best sense of apparent design? Probably because the current atheistic overlords of science are philosophically opposed to that possibility. There are many elements of reality that we cannot detect directly with our senses, but that's more about our limitations than the limits of reality. It looks to me like, as long as God is excluded, these folks are fine with making up stories and then seeking evidence to support them, as well as believing in things that help to make sense of other things, but for which they have no direct observations or evidence. Some of these folks openly admit their commitment to an atheistic ideology, and because of their philosophical commitment, they are willing to believe certain things even if there is no evidence.
We cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Because there are no alternatives, we would almost have to accept natural selection as the explanation of life on this planet, even if there were no evidence for it.
Thomas Nagel admitted what I believe is at the heart of the thinking of the atheistic intellectuals who go out of their way to claim that science has eliminated God.
I want atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that.
However, to his credit, Nagel was open-minded enough to later realize how philosophically distorted science had become. The famous atheist Antony Flew turned away from theism in his youth because of what he thought was science. However, later in life, he returned to theism because of the accumulating scientific evidence pointing in that direction. So that eventually led me to wonder, what concept of science and reason did European secularists embrace? In an earlier video, we summarized how the Enlightenment mindset developed. European intellectuals, for some valid reasons, rejected the Christianity they saw in 17th and 18th century Europe, and chose to diminish and demolish it by embracing a worldview that intentionally contradicted biblical concepts about nature's origins and processes. The Enlightenment's new stories were not built upon extensive observation and evidence, but upon an imagined philosophical scenario. Important information about thermodynamics, fossils, the complexity of a living cell, the genetic limitations on biological variation, and archaeological evidence in the Middle East were unknown to those who imagined the basic stories between 1700 and 1850. So, with all of the problems facing the stories developed from the Enlightenment and modern era, why do those in control of Western science seem so oblivious to them? First of all, like Thomas Nagel's earlier admission, they really want atheism to be true, and do not want an intelligent supernatural designer to exist or to be involved in nature or reality. Second, because of their anything but God agenda, they have been overly eager to buy into plausible-sounding Bible-contradicting stories, embrace them dogmatically, and never critically reevaluate them. This was admitted for Darwinism by philosopher of science Michael Ruse in court testimony in the 1980s.
Finally, in 1859, Charles Darwin published Origin of Species. And I think it's true to say that within a very short time, and I mean a very short time, certainly, the scientific community was won over to evolutionism. And from that day on, by the professional body of scientists, certainly by biologists, I don't think evolution has ever been questioned.
Darwinism was the kind of story secular intellectuals wanted to be true, so they bought into it early and have never questioned it. The same agenda was foundational to German Bible criticism, by which another alternative story was formulated that secular intellectuals wanted to believe. So it was also embraced quickly as dogma.
So completely did the scheme which Wellhausen elaborated meet the needs of his day, that it gained wide acceptance within a very short period of time.
As with Darwinism, because the promoters of Graf-Wellhausen biblical criticism were more committed to a philosophical agenda than evidence, as archaeology began to show the Bible to be more in tune with the ancient Middle East than their stories, they tended to either ignore the evidence or dismiss the discoveries as mere antiquities.
The Graf-Wellhausen school mostly ignored the possible effect which extra-biblical sources might have, the tendency of European scholars, generally, to describe such archaeological artifacts from Palestine as though they were merely antiquities.
Once Enlightenment-minded men and women controlled Western universities, their agenda was promoted by purging conservatives from the faculties and hiring only those academics who would faithfully promote Enlightenment stories. This practice has accelerated since the 1960s, and it has become very unlikely that you will find conservatives on the faculties of major Western universities. That is how you control a civilization. You control education, the media, and politics so that only what those in power hold as the correct viewpoint is promoted, while doubts and dissent are ignored or ridiculed and silenced. The medieval church tried it, and now Western secularists are engaged in it. The arrogance and hypocrisy of some evolutionists is incredible. Consider Tim Barra's comment about science and religion.
That is the big difference between science and religion. Science exists because of the evidence, whereas religion exists upon faith, and, in the case of religious fundamentalism and creationism, in spite of the evidence.
I would submit that there is a good deal more evidence for the Judeo-Christian worldview than people like Barra are aware of or would admit. However, when the topic is evolution, Michael Roos said that observation and evidence were not really that crucial. And it is not hard to find examples of evolution stories that were formulated and continue to be promoted without crucial evidence, or are even contrary to available evidence. Consider the fact that The Origin of Species was published in spite of the fact that Darwin was concerned that known fossils look nothing like his single-branching tree of life scenario. And if that did not change, it would pose a serious challenge to his theory. Top paleontologists have admitted that the fossil problem never got any better, but Darwinism continues to be promoted as science. What about Lyell, Huxley, and Darwin's books in 1863 and 1871, promoting the notion that humans evolved from the great apes, which several evolutionists have admitted were published with little or no supporting evidence? Life generating out of inanimate matter continues to be the orthodox story, although some experts admit that they do not have a clue how that could have happened. And how about George Wald's admission that the spontaneous generation of life from non-life has been scientifically disproven and is impossible, but to avoid the God answer, he was going to continue to believe it anyway?
When he, Pasteur, had finished, nothing remained of the belief in spontaneous generation. Most modern biologists, unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. One has only to contemplate the magnitude of the task, to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet, here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation.
So, what kind of science are atheists promoting? It does not appear to be traditional science which was committed to following evidence wherever it leads. Instead, it resembles Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, in which atheism is assumed to be true, and then stories are concocted upon that assumption that will result in conclusions that affirm what was assumed to begin with: atheism. Ernst Mayr admitted that Darwinism was not as much about science as shifting Western civilization from theism to atheism.
The Darwinian revolution was not merely the replacement of one scientific theory by another, as had been the scientific revolutions in the physical sciences, but rather the replacement of a worldview, in which the supernatural was accepted as a normal and relevant explanatory principle, by a new worldview in which there is no room for supernatural forces. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment. A commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced, by our a priori adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation, and a set of concepts, that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
According to Lewontin, some scientific claims run counter to common sense, are patently absurd, have failed to fulfill the confident promises made, and are unsubstantiated just-so stories, because modern science is now based on a commitment to materialistic philosophy that has shifted science so that it will produce only materialistic explanations. The main concern is keeping God out of the discussion of reality.
Surely science is about finding material explanations of the world.
Whereas reason and science used to be about following evidence towards the best explanation, whatever it was, these folks approached nature in the past with a predetermined conclusion, willing to only consider explanations that coincide with their assumed philosophical materialism and naturalism, no matter what the evidence looks like. Materialism is the belief that physical matter is all there is. Naturalism is the belief that natural processes alone have shaped matter into all of its forms, including life. Neither of these propositions were ever proven, merely assumed. So we find now that science has come to be understood in terms of an assumed materialistic naturalism.
Creation science, fails to display the most basic characteristic of science, reliance upon naturalistic explanations.
The first criterion is that any scientific theory must be naturalistic.
A central tenet of modern science is methodological naturalism. It seeks to explain the universe purely in terms of observed, or testable, natural mechanisms.
Many people believe that a supernatural force, or deity, created life. That explanation is not within the scope of science. Scientists, and particularly the professional students of evolution, are often accused of a bias toward mechanism, or materialism. Such biases may exist as inherent in the method of science. The most successful scientific investigation has, generally, involved treating phenomena as if they were purely materialistic, or naturalistic, rejecting any metaphysical or transcendental hypothesis, as long as a natural hypothesis seems possible.
Science, fundamentally, is a game. It is a game with one overriding and defining rule. Rule number 1, let us see how far, and to what extent, we can explain the behavior of the physical and material universe in terms of purely physical and material causes, without invoking the supernatural.
The Bible asserts that the visually evident design and magnitude of nature is evidence of its creator. And evolutionists admit that certain elements in nature do appear to have been intelligently designed.
Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. The design inference comes naturally. The reason people think that a designer created the world is because it looks designed. If anything is true about nature, it is that plants and animals seem intricately, and almost perfectly, designed for living their lives.
And yet, when I look through a microscope at a humble bacterium, it's extremely well organized. But on the other hand, the sheer scale of all of this unfamiliar, well-organized stuff that happens in there makes me feel like, I've stumbled onto an alternate landscape of technology that's built by an engineer 1,000,000 times smarter than me.
But to keep any biologist from swerving into the heresy of supernaturalism by considering that the design element might be evidence of a designer, some big shot will offer a stern warning.
Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved.
But what if things in nature suggesting design are not just apparent, but are actually what they look like, and are evidence of a designer? Then those committed to constructing a materialistic, naturalistic explanation for everything have actually been promoting a false view of nature and reality. What would happen to mathematics if it was taken over by people who were philosophically opposed to the number 4? Class would begin with, well, experts have already determined that the number 4 does not exist, so 2 plus 2 must equal something else, and we'll try to figure out what it does add up to. Or experts have rejected the existence of ducks, so even though it looks like a duck, waddles like a duck, and quacks, it can't be a duck. That is what atheists have done to science. They limit the possible explanations ahead of time so that only their assumptions and conclusions are allowed consideration. What used to be science has become the shackled servant of a contrived philosophical dogma.
Atheists have, simply, assumed the materialistic worldview is true, and defined the rules of science in such a way that the only possible answer is a materialistic theory, like Darwinism. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science, because it is not naturalistic.
These things led me to conclude that the good name of science had been hijacked, corrupted, and darkened to promote atheism. Once ultimate accountability to God is removed, lying about and distorting evidence to support a faulty predetermined agenda became a growing problem in science, not only in promoting larger paradigms or political agendas, but also in corrupting research so that it appears to deliver the desired results so as to win or renew research grants. Watch out for those who misuse the good name of science as a persuasion device to gain support. When someone claims that following the science means that you must agree with them, be sure that their view actually is the best explanation for the evidence. When someone asserts that disagreeing with them means that you're opposing science, they are arrogantly equating their view with science itself, using intimidation to gain support or avoid critical evaluation. Real science is promoted with solid, convincing evidence and logic, not arrogance, intimidation, or deceptive devices of persuasion.
Empiricism began as an effort to learn more about God, and became a way of understanding our world without God.
I would change that to empiricism began as an effort to learn more about nature, and became a way of understanding our world without God. Along with pondering the validity of that transformation, we should also be asking why it was done and how it was accomplished. The Enlightenment wanted to diminish and demolish what it saw as biblical supernaturalism in 17th and 18th century Europe, and replace it with what they hoped would be a rational and scientific secularism. The Enlightenment embraced the respected terms reason and science, but secularists had already determined what they wanted reality to look like, and the supernatural was not welcome. So they injected a subtle but powerful shift in the philosophical foundations underlying those terms. From physical matter and natural processes being the limit of what science could study, they asserted that matter and natural processes were the limit of reality. With that conceptual shift embraced intellectually, by nothing more than redefinition of terms, the supernatural was suddenly moved into the category of the unreal, so that it could then be labeled outside of the things that reason and science can discuss. And those still willing to allow the supernatural to be a part of reality could be portrayed as ignorant and superstitious religious fundamentalists, irrational and opposed to science. As previously noted, materialism is the belief that physical matter is the extent of reality, all that exists, while naturalism is the belief that natural processes alone shape matter into all of its forms, including life. The men of the Enlightenment eliminated God from reality by simply redefining reason, science, and reality in terms of philosophical materialism and naturalism. During the Enlightenment and modern era, The disciples of the Enlightenment worldview imagined and formulated new stories for nature in the past intended to contradict biblical ideas at every possible point, in the hope that reality would cooperate and eventually provide the expected evidence to support those stories. I gradually concluded that the accumulating evidence was not fulfilling their expectations, and that, while the Bible leaves lots of areas for true reason and science to fill in the details, reality looks a lot more like what the Bible is telling us. The universe had a beginning, created from nothing and designed. The early earth was covered with water. Life comes from prior life, and major kinds of life forms appeared at about the same time, capable of limited variation within those major groups. Humans are not descended from the apes, but are able to oversee other life forms. A curse of decay or decline was placed on the natural order. Christians do not want to eliminate observation and evidence-based science and research, nor do we want to substitute miracles to explain things for which there are discernible natural causes. But we do want atheists to drop their arrogant philosophical dogmatism in science, realize and admit that some of their evolution stories are not and never have been based on observation and evidence, and realize that materialism and naturalism may not be the answer to everything, and be open to other possibilities, especially when evidence, or the lack of it, continues to point somewhere other than their preferred scenario.